Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the deep and dreaming dark of the misty mountains, where the roots of the world run wide and whisper ancient secrets to stone and silence. There lay a city not made by time, but carved from it. Khazad-dûm, the Dwarf, the greatest of the Dwarven halls. There, beneath a ceiling of blackened mithril stars, the children of stone walked paths older than memory, and though the fires of their forges burned hot, and their hammers sang on anvil and oar, the sound that once echoed loudest in those vast halls had been forgotten. A sound not of tools nor gold, but of prayer. Many ages had passed since the name of Mahal was spoken with reverence. How the smith whom elves called the Maker and dwarves knew as father had shaped the first of their kind from earth and thought, breathing into them a fire not kindled by the sun, but by will itself. Yet in the long toil of centuries under burden and stone, the dwarves turned from their Maker, not in rebellion, but in forgetfulness. The rhythms of pick and forge replaced the old hymns. The sacred altars were buried beneath new vaults. What was divine became practical. What was holy became hidden. But stone remembers. And so, in a quiet corner of Khazad-dûm, far from the clangor of the great halls and the bright roar of the forges, a young dwarf named Balgrren dwelled among scrolls and silence. His beard was short, for he was young, and his fingers were ink-stained rather than calloused by hammers. He had the eyes of a seeker, wide, patient, and full of questions, and the elders often muttered that he spent too much time reading tales instead of writing ledgers. Balgrren did not mind. He felt drawn to the past like ore to magnet stone. While others charted the veins of silver and mithril in the deeps, he charted the veins of memory, tracking the old songs, the forgotten names, the dust-covered lore of his people. His favorite place was the Vault of the Quiet, a domed chamber in the oldest section of the library, where the stone GDK floor was worn by the footsteps of dwarves long gone, and the air was thick. It was on a still winter morning, though time in the deeps followed no sun, that Balgrren found it. Behind a crumbling shelf, where the rock itself had cracked from ancient strain, his fingers brushed something that did not belong. A corner of stone, too smooth to be natural, too deliberate to be accident. He dug with care, brushing away centuries of soot and slumber, until the object revealed itself. It was a tablet cut from deep-back obsidian, etched with runes older than any he had studied. But these were not records of lineage or stonecraft. No, these were curved, flowing runes, singing runes, ones used only for song and sanctity. His heart quickened. The first line was a name, Mahal, not as a myth, but his father. Then followed verses like flame trapped in stone, praises of Aulë's patience, hymns of creation, prayers woven with the grief of the dwarves' earliest loss, the fading of the divine from the works of their hands. Balgrren sat beside it, breath held as if the tablet might vanish like mist if he exhaled. The runes seemed to pulse faintly with a light not of this world, not bright, but warm, like the last ember in a long dead hearth, still waiting for breath. That night he did not sleep. His mind raced with thought, with memory, with questions no other seemed willing to ask. Why had these words been hidden? Why had they been abandoned, And most pressing of all, what might happen if they were remembered? The next day he brought the tablet before the Council of the Deep. It was no small thing to stand before the masters of Khazad-dûm. They were ancient, proud, and grim as the stone they ruled. Their beards were braided with gold, their voices low and slow as rivers beneath mountains. Balgrren, with his soft voice and scroll-laden robes, seemed a child among mountains. He placed the tablet before them, his hands trembling not with fear, but with reverence. This, he said, was found beneath the library vaults. It speaks of Mahal, of Aulë, our Maker, of songs we once sang, of prayers we once gave. Why have we forgotten? The eldest among the council, Thorn, the keeper, leaned forward, his eyes clouded with age, narrowed. "We do not forget," he said. "We endure, we build, we remember by making." "But is that remembrance?" Balgrren asked, his voice rising, not in defiance but in yearning. "Or is it survival?" A heavy silence followed. The council shifted, uncomfortable. One of the younger masters, Karam, "What do you want, boy? To turn forges into temples? Bring back the gods with chants and incense?" "I want," Balgrren said, "to remember not just what we made, but why we made it." His words fell like quiet hammers in the hall, soft but sure. The council adjourned without comment, and Balgrren was left alone with the echo of his own courage. Yet word spread in the taverns and workshops, in the mining tunnels and apprentices' halls. Dwarves spoke of the lore keeper who dared to speak of the Maker, not in jest, not in legend, but in longing. Some laughed, others frowned, a few listened. Among those few was a stone carver named Dervy, whose grandfather had once whispered prayers to the stone before carving, and a forge warden named Thala, who remembered a lullaby. Her mother sang, a song of Mahal's hands shaping the world like clay. They came to Balgrren not with belief, but with questions, and so a circle formed, not of priests, for there were none, but of seekers. Together they read the tablet, sang the old verses, and wondered aloud whether faith, like gold, might lie dormant until someone dared to dig for it. Yet not all were pleased. Beneath the stillness, opposition stirred like an old wound aching before a storm. For some remembered too well the days when devotion led to division and reverence to ruin. And so the first stone had been moved, and deep beneath the mountain something ancient began to stir. Not wrath, not fire, but memory. And memory, as Balgrren would come to learn, was a living thing. The silence of Khazad-dûm was not empty. It was layered, dense, shaped by time and toil like the strata of rock that bore its weight. It was a silence carved by generations of chisel and grief, by the wordless packed between stone and soul. The halls whispered not in voices, but in echoes. The creak of ancient beams, the rhythmic drip of distant water, the soft rumble of furnaces banked low for the night. And in that silence, Balgrren sat alone, the obsidian tablet before him like a buried heart unearthed, its runes faintly aglow GK light of his solitary lantern. Around him the chamber seemed to lean inward, walls weeping with condensation, as though stone itself mourned something half re-GK. He had not returned to his GDK after the council. The walls there felt too tight, the air too still, the space too hollow to contain the weight of what now stirred within him. Instead, he remained in the old scriptorum, where centuries of dust softened the edges of every sound, and the carved faces of forgotten lore keepers stared down from aloves with expressions of mild surprise and endless waiting. There, beneath their blind gaze, Balgrren spoke, not loudly, but with the steady resolve of a stream wearing away stone. "They do not understand," he said, his voice catching on the edge of a whisper. "They think this is a call to kneel, to bow before something greater. But it is not. It is a call to remember, to place our hands back upon the root of who we are. We build, yes, we mine, we forge, we tally and trade. But once we sang, not to be heard, but to be known." A flicker of movement stirred in the lantern's flame, casting the shadows of the runes across his face like a lattice of light and darkness. He traced them slowly with his fingers, not to read, but to listen. Outside the scriptorum, the corridors of Khazad-dûm stretched like veins, branching in every direction, some wide and polished from countless boots, others narrow and steep where only echoes dared tread. And down one such path footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, heavy with a thoughtfulness that came not from indecision, but from a desire to meet the moment with the weight it deserved. Dervy entered without knocking. She was old, though not ancient, and her hands bore the calluses of a life lived, shaping the stubborn truth of stone. Her hair, once black as coal, was streaked with threads of silver, like veins of mithril in granite. She stood in the doorway for a moment, saying nothing, her gaze falling upon the tablet with the reverence of one recognizing something sacred, though she would never call it so aloud. Balgrren did not rise to greet her. Instead, he gestured gently to the stone bench beside him. "The fire is still warm," he murmured. "It's been listening with me." Dervy sat without reply, and for a time the two of them stared into the soft light, letting the silence stretch, not as a void, but as a bridge between two minds not yet joined. At last she spoke, her voice low and thick, as though drawn from a well. "I carved a statue once, years ago," she said, "for the memorial hall. It was meant to be a likeness of Thorak Ironfist, the one who defended the East Gate during the War of Worms. I worked that stone for months. Each strike I thought of his face, stern, proud, marked by grief. He never spoke aloud. And when I finished, it didn't look like him. Not exactly, but the stone felt like him. Do you understand?" She turned her eyes to Balgrren, sharp and searching. It felt like memory wrapped in silence, like something more than likeness. And I remember before I laid down the chisel for the last time, I whispered to it. Not words, really, just a breath of grief, a breath of thanks. And the stone, I swear it listened. Balgrren met her gaze, and in that instant something passed between them. Not certainty, but recognition. "You heard it too," he said softly. "You felt what the elders call superstition, what they locked away in corners and let dust consume. But it was never dead. It was buried like veins of mithril, dormant, not gone." Dervy leaned back, her arms folded across her chest, the lines in her face deepening like fissures in wintered stone. "I came because I heard your words after council," she said. Most laughed, some scoffed, but a few went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks or something blooms. Balgrren nodded, his hands clasped tightly before him. "I do not want to lead," he said, the tremor in his voice not of fear, but of conviction, held under great weight. I want to restore, not power, not law, but wonder, awe. The kind that makes a dwarf look at the mountains not with conquest in his eyes, but with kinship in his heart. Dervy stared at him for a long while, her expression unreadable. Then, with a motion slow and deliberate, she reached into the folds of her tunic and drew forth a small stone, rough, uncut, yet flecked with glimmers of crystal. She placed it before the tablet beside the glowing runes. "My father gave me this," she said. "He said it was from the oldest seam, a piece untouched since the first delving. He told me to keep it near when I carved, so the mountain would remember me." Balgrren reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the stone. It was warm, not with heat, but with presence, a quiet kind of heartbeat, steady and slow. And for a moment the air shifted. The walls of the scriptorum, once merely ancient stone, seemed to lean closer. The dust stirred in patterns not drawn by wind. The carved visages of the lore-keepers looked less like watchers and more like listeners. "It begins here," he whispered. "Not with ritual, not with fire or gold, but with the breath of memory stirred from sleep." Dervy said nothing more. She rose, leaving the stone behind, and her footsteps echoed down the corridor like a song half-remembered, waiting to be sung again. Balgrren sat alone once more, but he did not feel alone. The air had changed. The silence now hummed faintly like a drumbeat beneath the skin of the world. Outside the scriptorum, in the unseen deeps, the mountain trembled, not with violence, but with awakening. And in the farthest reaches of Khazad-dûm, in a sealed chamber long forgotten, a vein of crystal pulsed softly in time with the breath of the one who made them. Mahal, the father, still listening, there is a peculiar stillness that dwells in the heart of ancient places, not born of mere silence, but of time itself. Time that is settled like fine ash across every surface. Like the dust of forgotten dreams layered so thickly upon the stone that even light enters cautiously, its golden fingers hesitant to disturb what lies beneath. In Khazad-dûm, that stillness was not simply the absence of movement or sound. It was the long exhalation of the mountain itself, the breath held between ages, between one memory and the next. And in that deep breath, a change had begun, a tremor not of earth, but of spirit. Balgrren sat once more in the scriptorum, the obsidian tablet before him like a slumbering relic from a world where the soul of a people had not yet been bartered entirely for steel and trade. Around him, the room seemed more alive than ever before, not in a way that eyes could easily perceive, but in the subtle shifts of temperature, the almost imperceptible hum in the stone beneath his feet, the way the carved runes on the walls caught the lantern light as though they drank it with thirst. It felt, he thought, as if the very walls had ears, and not just ears, but memories, as though they were watching and waiting to see if at last one among the living would dare to speak the old names without shame, would dare to feel reverence without mockery, and would dare to seek without certainty. Dervy returned with two others. Thala, the forge warden whose hands bore the dark gloss of iron fire, and Balgrren, a miner who walked as if each step were carved deliberately into the world beneath him. They did not speak at first. They merely entered, their boots echoing in solemn rhythm, and they stood near the fire as though seeking warmth not merely for their bodies, but for their minds, which had grown cold from long years of silence on matters too sacred to name. It was Thala who spoke first, her voice rough and lined with embers, the kind of voice shaped not by age alone, but by countless nights spent alone with flame. "My grandfather used to speak of Mahal," she said, not meeting Balgrren's gaze, but staring instead into the heart of the fire. "Not often, and only when the forge was quiet, and the coals burned low, and the day's labor was behind us. He said that every spark in the forge was a breath of Aulë, a whisper from the time before the world was hardened with pride. He'd say, 'Child, the fire does not serve you. It listens to you. And sometimes, if you speak to it with the right kind of silence, it answers.'" I laughed. When I was young, I thought it was the ramblings of an old dwarf, half dreaming of the past. But now she trailed off, her eyes reflecting the firelight like twin smoldering coals. And the silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the weight of that unfinished sentence, with the echo of something not yet spoken aloud. Balgrren shifted, his broad shoulders hunched, not with fear, but with the burden of knowing he was crossing a threshold that had stood unspoken in his heart for many years. "I used to sing when I mined," he said slowly, his voice deep and quiet, like the rumble of earth before a cave-in. Not loud, not like the old marching songs, just a hum, low and steady to keep rhythm with the pig. "There's an echo, you know, down in the deeps. When you find the right kind of stone, it hums back. Not like a proper echo." "Not your own voice," returned. "No, it's different. Older. Sometimes I'd feel it vibrate in my bones, like the rock itself was remembering a song it hadn't heard in a long time. I never told anyone. Thought I was going mad." Balgrren looked up from the tablet. Then his eyes full not just of light, but of quiet, aching gratitude, the kind that comes when long-held doubts are shared and not scorned. "You weren't mad," he said, his voice barely above a breath, yet filled with a resonance that made even the dust in the room seemed to still. "You were being answered. You were heard." Dervy placed her hands upon the stone bench, leaning forward with the deliberate weight of someone who had spent a lifetime shaping the world, and now sought to shape something deeper within herself. "They'll say we're dreamers," she murmured, "that we're trying to bring back a fire that died long ago, that reverence is a weakness, and that the mountain answers only to strength, not to song. But I have seen too much carved into the bones of the earth to believe that stone remembers nothing. I have seen the way water carves canyons, not by might, but by persistence. And I say, let us persist." Outside, the mountain groaned softly, distantly like a sleeper turning beneath heavy blankets of earth in time. It was not an ominous sound, not the herald of collapse or danger, but the stirring of something ancient, something vast and long buried. The torches along the corridor flickered in that moment, and the stone of the floor vibrated beneath their feet, as if the mountain was adjusting to accommodate something new, or perhaps something old returned. Balgrren stood, his posture uncertain at first, like one who had spent too long bent over books and now must bear a banner he had never asked for. But as he spoke, his voice grew, not in volume, but in depth, drawing up from a place within him that had never before been touched by words. "There is something in us," he said, "that reaches deeper than history, deeper than records or rites. It is the knowledge that we were made not by chance, but with intention. We were not called into being to conquer stone, but to be its kin, to learn from it, to honor it, to live in harmony with it. The mountain is not our slave. It is our elder. It is our cradle. And if we forget the one who shaped us, then we become hollow, even if our halls are filled with gold. He stepped closer to the fire, letting its glow cast long shadows behind him. The runes on the tablet shimmered faintly, catching the light as if drawn to the words being spoken, like moths circling the flame of remembrance. "I do not ask for temples," Baldwin continued, his hands open at his sides, "nor chants, nor rituals born of duty. I ask only this, that we remember, that we breathe again the names that gave us breath, that we listen not just to each other, but to the forge, to the rock, to the quiet. For there is wisdom in the silence, and sometimes when all else fails, it is only the silence that speaks true." No one spoke immediately, but slowly, one by one, they placed their hands upon the stone. Dervy first, then Balgrren, and together they stood, not as followers, not as converts, but as kin, reunited with something they had never truly lost, only misplaced. And outside, where few dared tread, a forgotten stair cracked open with the slow, stubborn groan of time itself. Dust spilled forth, and with it came a draught of air older than kings, colder than the deepest mine, and yet filled with the strange, subtle sweetness of beginnings. Somewhere far below, in a chamber carved before even Duran awoke, the first ember stirred in a long dead briar, and the mountain listened. The mountain had always spoken, though not in words. Its language was one of rumble and silence, of echo and tremor, of lightless corridors stretching into ages untouched. To most who lived within Khazad-dûm, these sounds were background noise, the breathing of a living stone so constant and familiar it no longer registered in the mind. But now, in the quiet hours, when the forge fires dimmed and the last hammerfall ceased, the mountain's murmur seemed to shift, to deepen, as though it had heard a name it had long awaited, as though the stone itself was beginning to remember something holy that time had tried to smooth away. Balgrren felt this change not in the ears, but in the marrow of his bones, as if each step he took now was being observed by something vast and unseen. Not malevolent, not even sentient in the way flesh is, but present, ancient, and filled with a gravity that shaped not only tunnels, but the soul of those who dared walk them with reverence. He wandered now, not as a scholar, but as one called, though the calling was without words, without promise, and yet all the more powerful for its silence. With every turn of the corridor, every torchlit Aulë passed, every vaulted stone that had loomed above his childhood dreams now felt alive, not as if awake, but as if waiting. It was near the Hall of Origins that the call grew strongest, a place most dwarves passed with only a glance, its statues worn smooth by centuries of indifference, its runes half faded, half effaced by time and disuse. Yet even in its disrepair, the hall bore the gravity of something more than history. The air was different here, thicker, heavy, not with dust, but with the weight of unspoken truths. The flame of Balgrren's lantern flickered oddly, not with breeze, but as if reacting to an unseen breath that passed through the chamber walls. He paused before a statue, one of 7, each said to represent the fathers of the dwarves, those first shaped by Mahal and hidden until the children of Ilúvatar awoke. The stone eyes stared out into some unfathomable distance, and Balgrren, for the first time in his life, felt as though they looked back, not as a test, not with judgment, but with sorrowful patience, like a parent watching a child who has only just begun to ask the right question. Then came the voice, soft, crackling, filled with the hesitation of someone unsure if the moment had truly come. "You feel it too." Balgrren turned. Thala stood behind him, not clad in her forged leathers, but in a cloak of deep charcoal gray, embroidered not with symbols of trade or craft, but with a stylized spiral of an ancient flame, long out of use. Her face bore the soot mark of a ritual he did not know, but recognized instinctively, as one might recognize the scent of the earth after rain. She stepped forward slowly, her boots echoing softly against the stone, the sound somehow respectful, like footsteps within a tomb. "Yes," he said. Not a voice exactly, but something beneath the silence, as if the mountain is remembering something long buried. She stopped beside him, gazing at the statue. Her fingers brushed the old carvings, the gesture not unlike a lover's touch across a face long missed. "My grandfather used to say, 'The mountain does not forget,'" she murmured. "Only waits. That time does not erode memory, only obscures it, like dust on a mirror. We think silence is absence, but he said it was presence. Too full to speak." Balgrren was quiet for a long while. Then he said, "We've been taught to listen only to the clamor of work, to the roar of forge, to the weight of coin, to the tallying of stone pulled from the dark. But this," he gestured to the air itself, to the stillness between echoes, "this is older, quieter. It speaks not to our minds, but to something deeper, to the marrow of our purpose." Thala nodded slowly. "Do you know the tale of the stone that sang?" she asked. Balgrren shook his head. She smiled faintly, eyes still on the statue. "It is a tale almost no one tells anymore. They say that when Aulë he made the first of our kind, he did not give us speech as elves or men know it. Not first, not yet. Instead, he gave us rhythm, pulse, the echo of hammers and heartbeats. And the first dwarves, before they had names, spoke with stone, not with words, but with vibration, with movement. And there was one among them who sang, not with mouth, but through the pick and chisel. He would strike stone, and the earth would answer with sound. His kin called him the listener. He did not lead, nor build, nor forge, but all came to hear him, for he reminded them they were not alone, that the stone was not dead, that it too remembered. Her voice trailed off like smoke rising from quenched flame, and Balin stood long in that silence, imagining it, imagining a world where the mountain had not merely been carved, but conversed with, a world where each stroke of the hammer was not only work, but worship. He thought of the forges now, how loud they were, how eager to drown out silence with noise, as if fearing what the quiet might reveal. "Do you think," he asked softly, "that the mountain still listens?" Bala turned to him, and for the first time her voice bore no certainty, only wonder. "I think," she said, "the question is whether we do." At that moment, a tremor passed through the hall, not sharp, not violent, but unmistakable. The torches did not flicker as before, they pulsed, as if breathing. The stone beneath their feet hummed, not loudly, but in a way that drew the breath from their chests and held it as though the mountain itself had stirred from slumber, just enough to murmur, yes, they did not run. They did not cry out. They stood as one stands beneath stars long lost to light, knowing that they witnessed not the extraordinary, but the return of something once believed, lost beyond recall. Balgrren placed his hand on the statue's base. The stone was warm. "Then we must find the place it waits," he whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with something near to reverence. "We must go where the silence is deepest." Thala looked to him, and her eyes held a quiet that no forge could melt. "I believe," she said, "there is an altar still buried beneath the black veins past the old shaft. It was spoken of in the earliest chronicles before the days of Durin's line. A chamber carved not for kings nor councils, but for prayer." Belreen's heart stirred, not with certainty, but with the deep, unshakable pull of purpose. "Then we go there," he said, "not with fanfare, not with pride, but with listening hearts." The statue said nothing, but the shadows on the walls lengthened, and the light that danced upon the stone took on the hue of something older than fire. And somewhere deep beneath their feet, beyond the reach of tunnels, mapped or forgotten, a single note sang faintly through the stone. A note so low and soft it could not be heard, only felt. The mountain was no longer merely watching, it was waiting. There are places beneath the earth where the dark is not merely absence of light, but presence, thick breathing, ancient, where the air clings not as a mist, but as memory itself, and where each step echoes not forward, but backward, as though the world beneath the stone does not lead onward, but inward, toward something old and buried that does not wish to be awakened, and yet stirs nonetheless when names long untold are spoken once again with reverence. It was into such a place that Balgrren and Thala now ventured, descending through narrow passageways rarely walked in living memory, where the torches coughed and sputtered as if the fairy walls resisted their glow, and where the carvings upon the arches had faded not from time alone, but from neglect. The kind of fading that comes not when a story ends, but when it is deliberately sealed away. The old shaft was a wound in the bones of Khazad-dûm, a place once mined and then abandoned, not for lack of yield, but for something else. Something never named aloud, as though the act of speaking it would give its shape. Even the stone seemed hesitant here. The walls no longer bore the proud polish of Dwarven masonry, but wore instead the raw, jagged uncertainty of untouched rock, as if the very mountain had refused to be shaped further. And the deeper they descended, the more the air thickened, not just with the closeness of stone, but with the weight of anticipation. Like the breath before prayer long delayed, they moved in silence for some time, for words felt brittle in that place, liable to shatter into echoes they might not recognize as their own. But at last Balgrren spoke, his voice subdued, shaped by awe and uncertainty, like a child recalling a dream he is not sure was his. "I used to believe," he said, "that history was written in ledgers, that what we forgot was gone, and what we remembered was all that mattered. But now I think that memory does not fade because we let go of it. It fades because we are afraid of what remembering might require. Reverence is not comfortable. It demands something of us. It demands humility, the kind that bends the knee not to a king, but to a truth too large to hold. It asks us to see ourselves not as masters, but as children cradled in stone hands." Thala, walking just ahead, did not turn to him, but her voice answered like a note played low on a forge bellows, soft and steady. "That fear," she said, "is older than any of us. When my mother died, I remember standing at her pee and my heart was so full of grief that I could not speak. But when the flames rose, I felt her presence, not in the fire, but in the stone beneath my feet, as if the mountain had taken her in. Not just her bones, but her essence. I whispered her name to the rock, and though it gave no answer, I felt something shift, like a sigh or a promise. It was the first time I understood what it meant to believe in something you could not prove, but could not deny. Her voice trembled at the end, but not with sorrow, with something deeper. The ache of rediscovery, like stumbling upon a childhood keepsake buried deep in the folds of memory, still carrying the scent of love. They paused at a place where the tunnel narrowed, where a stone door stood half-sunken into the floor, as though the mountain itself had tried to swallow it back into forgetfulness. Upon it were runes unlike those etched in trade or craft. They curved with the grace of song, and they glowed faintly beneath the torchlight, not as a light reflects, but as something remembered begins to stir. Balgrren reached out, his hand hovering just above the runes, as if afraid that touch would erase them. But instead, as his fingers neared, the lines flared softly with golden warmth, like coal stirred from beneath cold ash. He did not press the door. He simply whispered, a word not taught to him, but given by the stone itself. Thala inhaled sharply. "The old word," she said, barely louder than breath. "Water of the spirit." "You heard it?" He nodded. No, not heard. Felt as if the stone placed it in me. The door opened, not with the groan of ancient hinges, but with a sigh, long and low, like the final breath of a mountain that has waited too long to be remembered. What lay beyond was not a room, but a sanctum, a space carved not with tools, but with intention. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with veins of polished obsidian, shot through with veins of silver and gold, not placed but revealed, as though the mountain had yielded its finest to something it respect. In the center was a dais, not raised but sunken, shaped like a bowl, and within it a single brazier of blackened bronze, cold and lifeless. Yet the stillness there was not that of death. It was the hush of breath held in anticipation. Balgrren stepped inside, and the moment his foot crossed the threshold, he felt it. The pressure of presence, not hostile, but heavy, like the weight of a hand placed gently on his shoulder by someone who had been waiting a very long time. The silence here was not emptiness, but attention. Thala knelt at the edge of the dais, her head bowed, her voice low. "This is the hollow of Mahal," she said. "The place where the first fathers were named. Not born, but named. For to name a thing is to call it into being. And this is where the soul of our people was once acknowledged." Valkyrie moved to the brazier and placed his hand upon it. It was cold, as expected. But beneath that cold was something else. A thrum, faint like the heartbeat of stone. He withdrew the shard of the obsidian tablet he had carried, the one that had begun all of this, and laid it gently within the brazier. Nothing happened. And then everything did. The veins in the walls began to shimmer, not with firelight, but with a soft inner glow, like starlight filtered through the deep. The brazier pulsed once, and a single tongue of flame rose, not fierce, but unwavering, steady, as if it had never truly gone out, only waited for someone to bring it breath. Balgrren dropped to his knees, his vision blurred. not from heat, but from tears that came not from sadness, but from recognition. This was not revelation, it was reunion. "I do not come as a priest," he whispered. "I do not come as prophet. I come as child, as stone returned to stone. Let us remember." And in the stone around them, in the veins and hollows of Khazad-dûm, in the paths forgotten and the echoes long stilled, a song began, not with words, but with vibration, with pulse, with rhythm. The mountain remembered. It is a strange thing the way stone can feel alive, not in the crude sense of motion or will, but in the deeper, quieter way that trees are alive in winter, bare but breathing, silent yet sensing, holding within their seemingly inert form 1,000 memories of sunlight and wind and growth in that sacred hollow deep beneath the roots of the mountain, where flame burned not for warmth, but for remembrance. The walls themselves seemed to exhale, as if they had been holding their breath for an age, and now at last could sigh in relief. The brazier's gentle flame cast no shadows, for it burned with the light that was not of fire alone, but of something older and finer, a light that did not consume, but revealed. Balgrren remained kneeling beside the brazier, his head bowed, not in submission, but in communion, and the stone beneath him, cold and firm, seemed to soften somehow, as though it recognized the weight of his presence and cradled it, like a parent might hold the hand of a returning child who had been long away. He could not speak for some time, not for lack of words, but because his heart was too full, his chest swollen with a grief that was not his alone. It was the grief of centuries, the sorrow of a people who had traded wonder for certainty, reverence for routine, and in doing so had not lost their strength, but something quieter, something gentler, something holy. Thala, too, knelt in stillness, her face lit by the flame's soft glow. The harsh lines of her features, shaped by years of fire and forge, seemed to soften as though touched by memory. She broke the silence not with a declaration, but with a whisper, tentative, reverent. "This place," she said, "is not hollow. It is full, full of things we once knew but chose to forget. I feel as if every moment of my life has led me here. Every spark I struck, every blade I tempered, was calling out to something I could not name. And now I know I was never forging alone. I was always watched, always accompanied." Balgrren turned his gaze toward her, and his eyes, moist with the shimmer of awe, carried the depth of a well newly opened. "I used to think the gods were distant," he said softly, "or perhaps gone. I imagine Mahal as a smith who created and walked away, leaving us to our tools and our pride. But I was wrong. He is here not as a presence to be obeyed, but as a memory we live within. He is the rhythm in the rock, the silence between hammer falls, the warmth in the forge that comes from more than fire." Thala nodded, but her face remained troubled, thoughtful, as though she were listening not only to Balgrren, but to something deeper still, something the stone was murmuring directly into her bones. "Do you think," she asked slowly, "that it was us who turned away? Or did the world change so much that even Mahal had to fall silent? I think about that sometimes. I think about the way the wind no longer howls through the high chambers, the way the water no longer sings in the deep cisterns." Her words were not bitter, but heavy like the weight of sorrow borne for so long it had become indistinguishable from the soul that carried it. Balgrren took a long breath, the kind of breath that draws not just air, but understanding. "I think the divine does not vanish," he said. "It recedes like the tide, not out of anger, but out of mercy. It waits, giving us space to choose, not to obey, but to return. Mahal is not a tyrant, he is a father. And what father forces love? No, he waits, not at the gates of fire and judgment, but in the hollow of memory where we are most ourselves." At these words the flame flickered, not with wind, for no breeze stirred that chamber, but with something else, something unseen. It was as though the fire had listened, and in listening, had agreed. The walls shimmered faintly, and the veins of silver that ran through the obsidian gleamed like riverways lit by starlight. Thala rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as though she feared to disturb the sanctity of that moment. She stepped to the wall and placed her hand upon it, palm flat, fingers spread, and the rock beneath her touch warmed subtly, as if responding to the contact not with heat, but with remembrance. "There is more here," she said quietly. "Not just memory, but promise. A kind of waiting that is not passive, but pregnant. Something beneath this chamber calls, still, not just to be remembered, but to be restored." Balgrren approached, and his hand joined hers upon the stone. Together they stood listening, not with ears, but with the whole of themselves. And in that deep silence they felt it, a pulse low and slow like the heartbeat of the world itself. Not metaphor, not poetry, but real. An echo that moved through their bones and whispered to their spirits. "We are not the first to stand here," Balgrren murmured, "and we will not be the last. But perhaps we are the first in many lifetimes to listen." The flame, now steady and sure, burned brighter, but not blindingly. It remained soft, gentle, like a lantern held by a kind hand in a long night. They sat once more and spoke at length, not as teacher and student, not as allies or founders, but as pilgrims. Two souls who had taken separate paths and found themselves together at the same door, not because they planned it, but because the mountain had called them both. They spoke of old songs that had no melodies anymore, of carved symbols buried beneath newer stone, of forgotten names etched into the foundations of cities now revered only for their walls and not their wombs. And as they spoke, the chamber responded, not with voice or gesture, but with presence. It was as if the mountain approved. "I wonder," Thala said after a long pause, "what others would feel if they stood here. If Dervy were here, or would they feel it too? Or is this something that only calls to those who already long for it?" Balgrren considered this, his brow furrowed in the glow. "Perhaps it is not a question of who is called," he said, "but who is quiet enough to hear. We live in a world of noise, of coin and clamor and pride. But this is not the sound of conquest. It is the murmur of becoming." He stood then, and for the first time he felt not like a lone seeker, but like a vessel, empty of vanity, yet full of meaning. The chamber, the stone, the fire, they were not artifacts. They were companions, teachers, witnesses, and they had waited long enough. "We must return," he said, "not to tell, but to invite, to bring others here, not to see, but to feel, to let them stand where we have stood, and ask nothing of the mountain but remembrance. Thala nodded, her eyes glistening. And if they refuse? If they laugh? Then the stone will wait, he said, as it always has. They left the chamber in silence, but as they crossed the threshold, the flame did not dim. It remained steady and quiet, a sentinel of memory and grace. And far above, in the high halls of Khazad-dûm, a song began to rise in the dreams of sleeping dwarves. Wordless, ancient, gentle, a song not sung in ages, a song of stone, of sorrow, and of home. The path back through the old tunnels was not the same as the descent had been. Though the stone walls bore the same cracks and carvings, though the torchlight flickered in familiar rhythms, and though their steps echoed in patterns they had already traced, the air felt different now, as if something unseen and immense had shifted beneath the surface of things. The silence no longer carried the stillness of waiting, but the stirrings of awakening, like the hush that settles over a vast forest just before the wind arrives, rustling the leaves into a chorus that is not sung in many seasons. The very rock seemed to breathe with them, each breath a reminder that they were not alone, that they were never alone, and that all this time the mountain had been watching, not with eyes, but with patience. Balgrren walked ahead, lantern in hand, but his gaze wandered often, not from distraction, but from reverence. For he was no longer simply navigating corridors of stone, but walking through the pages of a forgotten book. Every etching on the wall, every worn arch, every quiet fold in the stone, now a word, a phrase, a verse in the long, slow poem of Dwarven becoming. He reached out once to trace a symbol, barely visible beneath centuries of soot and grime, and as his fingers brushed it, he felt not texture but story, not shape but sorrow. Something buried, yes, but never severed. It was like the ache one feels in the place of a scar, not from the wound, but from the healing. Thala, walking behind him, was silent, but her silence was not born of weariness. It was the silence of fire banked low, deep, and hot, waiting for the moment when air and need would call it back into flame. Her mind was heavy with thoughts that swirled like embers in a draught, memories of her childhood when her grandmother would sing to the forge, not with any song known to craft, but with a melody that seemed to rise unbidden from the coals themselves. A lullaby meant not for the ears of others, but for the heart of the iron. She remembered thinking, even as a child, that there was something sacred in that sound, something more than technique, more than trade. It was a communion, and now, for the first time, she had words for it. "I never realized," she said at last, her voice quiet as though speaking too loudly would offend the stone, "how much of myself I had given away without ever noticing. I thought I was strong because I had mastered my tools, because I could shape blade and plate and hinge with precision and certainty. But now I see that strength was only the surface. Beneath it I was hollow, not broken, not lost, just untouched by the depth of what was meant to live inside us." Balgrren turned, and the light from his lantern caught the lines of her face, casting them in gentle gold. And in that light he saw not weariness, but clarity, like the face of a miner who has broken through the last wall of stone and glimpsed at last the gleam of a hidden vein. "I think," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that we were not made to forget, but we were made to be free. And sometimes freedom is misused, not with evil intent, but with distraction. We built so much, We traded so far, we tunneled so deep, that we ceased to ask why. The act of shaping became more important than what we shaped, and so the spirit of our craft, it faded, not because we banished it, but because we stopped listening. He looked upward where the ceiling arched into shadow, and he felt again the subtle hum in the walls like a lullaby hummed by the world itself. "But the mountain remembers," he whispered. "It holds every word we once spoke in reverence, every song hummed in secret, every breath that trembled with awe. And now it waits, not for sermons, not for temples, but for return." When they emerged at last into the mid-halls, where the great pillars of Khazad-dûm rose like trunks of ancient trees into the vaulted dark, they did not speak, for the sight was different now, not changed, but revealed. The light of the forges cast long shadows that no longer seemed merely black shapes, but remnants of voices lingering against the walls. The sound of pick and hammer echoed not as labor, but as heartbeat, steady, persistent, the pulse of a people remembering who they were. And as they stepped into that space, others turned to look. Not many, and not with wide eyes of wonder, but with the subtle, curious glances of those who have noticed something shift in the atmosphere, like the sudden scent of rain on dry stone. Dervy was among them, her sharp gaze narrowing as she watched the two return. And when she approached, it was not with questions but with a silence that begged for answers without demanding them. Balgrren met her gaze, and for a moment they stood together, eyes locked, speaking nothing aloud. And then, with a voice low and thick with meaning, Dervy said, "Something's changed." Thala nodded, her voice roughened by ash and awe. Not something, everything, and nothing at all. It's like finding an old carving beneath layers of dust and grime. You haven't made anything new. You've just remembered what was always there. Dervy tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. And now Balgrren answered her with the certainty not of one who knows the future, but of one who has accepted the past. Now we listen. Now we gather, not with speeches or banners, but with open hearts. There is a place below, a chamber made not for kings, but for us, for all of us, and it waits to be filled, not with ceremony, but with presence. Others had drawn closer now, their faces lined with questions, with hesitation, but also with a kind of silent hunger, the kind of yearning that one feels in the bones on a quiet night when the stars seem to press close and the air itself seems to whisper, "You are not alone." Balgrren looked at them not as a leader, but as a brother. He raised no voice, made no grand plea. He simply opened his arms and said, "Come." Not to see, not to follow, but to remember. And one by one they came, slowly, like water trickling into an old well. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm followed the quiet voices of two who had knelt in the dark and lit a flame, not with fire, but with remembrance down into the old ways they walked. Not as workers, not as craftsmen, not even as pilgrims, but as children returning to a home whose door had never truly closed. The mountain watched, the flame waited, and the silence sang. The descent of many feet into the forgotten places of the earth was not a march, nor a pilgrimage in the traditional sense, but something quieter, something deeper. It was like the movement of roots growing downward through soil that has lain untouched for ages. Seeking not light but the memory of water, the corridors, once hollowed by purpose and now burdened by years of neglect, began to stir with the murmured sounds of dwarves not talking loudly, but whispering, as if in the presence of something sacred they could not yet name. The stone absorbed their steps like breath returning to lungs long collapsed, and the air, thick with dust and the faint tang of old metal, seemed to awaken, as if the very particles of ancient soot recognized the echoes of voices they had once known, and rejoiced silently in their return. Balgrren led them not with proclamations or raised torches, but with the steadiness of one who walks beside a great truth, not ahead of it. His lantern flickered with the softest light, not brilliant, but unwavering, and behind him came Thala, her presence like a forge, banked low, not yet blazing, but pulsing with quiet heat. And following them came Dervy, Balgrren, and a dozen others, blacksmiths and stonehers, lore keepers and laborers, elders and apprentices, those who had in their own ways felt the subtle pull of the forgotten, that ancient gravity drawing them back toward the core of something they had not known they missed until they felt its absence fill. No words were exchanged for a long time, only the rhythmic scuff of boots on stone, the occasional clearing of a throat, and the distant drip of water. An elemental sound, soft but insistent, like the ticking of time within the world's deepest clock. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a kind of harmony, a stillness filled with expectancy, as if the very walls were tuning themselves to the music of presence, preparing for the return of voices that would not demand, but remember. It was Dervy who first broke the quiet, her voice grally with age and soot in a lifetime of unspoken thoughts. "I once believed that meaning was made at the forge," she said, her gaze fixed not on those before her, but on the stone passing slowly beside her. That the clang of hammer against steel was the only language worth knowing. But lately, I've begun to wonder if all we've been doing is shouting into a silence we never truly listened to. Perhaps it is not the hammer that gives the forge its spirit, but the pause between strikes, the breath, the waiting, the choosing of where next to strike. Perhaps meaning lives not in the doing, GK in the listening before the doing. GK. Belgian looked back at her, his face half lit by the lantern glow, and nodded slowly, as if affirming something he had carried in his heart since the moment he found the tablet. There's a kind of arrogance in thinking that noise alone is life. He said that the louder we work, the more we live. But the mountain does not shout. The mountain endures. And in that endurance, there is memory. Quiet, patient, deep. I think our mistake was not in forgetting our stories, but in forgetting how to dwell in silence long enough to hear the stories that were never written, the ones carved in the places we feared to enter, the ones told not with words, but with presence. The others listened, and their expressions bore the subtle transformation of those who were not merely hearing something new, but recognizing something old, something buried not in libraries, but in the folds of their very being. The youngest among them, a lad named Balgrren, barely come of age, spoke then, his voice uncertain, but filled with a kind of raw honesty, untouched by the polish of age. "My father used to say that the gods were for elves," he said, eyes flicking nervously from face to face. He said, "We dwarves have stone and fire and steel, and that's all we need." But I never believed him. I couldn't, not really. I always felt that there was something underneath all of it, a kind of hum. When I'd sit alone in the mines, waiting for the others, I'd feel it, like the stone was watching or waiting. I thought it was just me. I thought I was broken somehow. "No," said Thala, her voice unexpectedly gentle, like an ember flickering into flame. "You weren't broken. You were listening." They reached the hollow of Mahal, then not as a crowd, but as a current, flowing into a space that received them not as intruders, but as long-awaited kin. The flame in the brayer still burned, though it had not been fed, and its light reached toward them, not in flickers, but in quiet pulses, like the breathing of a sleeping world, now slowly stirring to wakefulness. The walls, black and gleaming, with veins of silver, shimmered faintly, and the air was charged, not with magic, but with memory so dense it felt like mist on the skin. No one spoke for a long while. They stood arrayed in a ring around the dais, and in that stillness each one of them felt the gravity of the moment. The way the floor beneath them seemed to hold them up, not only with stone, but with meaning. The way the chamber did not echo their breath, but accepted it, cradled it, added it to the long history of breaths taken in that sacred space. It was not awe that held them still. It was recognition. Then Balgrren stepped forward, not to speak, but to kneel, and the sound of his knees touching the stone was like a chisel tapped gently against old granite, soft but unmistakable. And one by one the others followed. No ceremony had been planned, no rite had been rehearsed, yet they knelt as though they had always known they would, as though some part of their souls had waited generations for this act of return. Balgrren placed his hand upon the brayer, and the flame flared, not in height, but in color, shifting for a moment into a deep golden hue, like the first light of dawn spilling through the cracks of a sealed tomb. He spoke then, not with authority, but with reverence, his voice low and measured, as if addressing not just those present, but the very foundation of the world. "We have come," he said, "not to rebuild a religion, nor to create a doctrine, nor to claim a forgotten throne. We have come to remember, to kneel not before a God of fire and wrath, but before the truth that we are not alone. We were shaped with hands of wisdom, and in our hearts there is still the echo of that first shaping. We have dug deep into the earth for treasure, for power, for survival. But we have forgotten to dig for meaning, and now we remember." The flame answered, not with words, but with warmth that reached each of them, a warmth that did not burn, but soothed like the embrace of a long-lost parent whose arms were made not of flesh, but of stone, silence, and the music of patience. And in that moment Khazad-dûm changed, not in stone, but in soul. The dwarves had begun to remember. Night in the deeps of Khazad-dûm did not come with stars or moonlight, but with a deepening of quiet, a settling of breath in the bones of the stone, a stillness that wrapped itself around flame and flesh alike, not in coldness, but in contemplation. The hollow of Mahal lay aglow, its silent fire burning steady and low, not as beacon nor warning, but as memory, unwavering, patient, ageless. And around it the gathered dwarves remained, some kneeling, some seated with backs against the smooth curve of obsidian wall, and others simply standing with heads bowed, not in submission, but in the vulnerable reverence of those who have glimpsed something greater than themselves and have not been diminished, but expanded by it. They did not speak in bursts or declarations, but in soft phrases passed like river stones from hand to hand. Each word smoothened by reflection, each sentence soaked in the quiet light of revelation. Thala had not moved from her place beside the briar. Her fingers, rough with the years of hammer and tong, lay gently across her knees, her eyes, unfocused and soft, not blind, but turned inward, as if listening to some old song carried along the inner caverns of her soul. When she spoke, it was not to any one dwarf in particular, but to the air itself, or perhaps to the flame, or perhaps to that unseen thread that now wound itself among them all, like the roots of trees rediscovering the shared soil of their origin. "There is a kind of silence," she said, "that speaks not of absence, but of fullness, like the silence of a forge just before the metal glows, or the hush between the falling of snow and its settling upon the earth." That is what I feel here. Not that we've found something new, but that we've finally stopped speaking long enough to hear something that's been waiting to be heard. And I wonder how often in our lives do we mistake the absence of sound for emptiness, when it might just be the pause before truth arrived. Balgrren, seated a short distance away, nodded, his gaze fixed not upon her, but upon the flame, which danced now with a rhythm that seemed to echo the cadence of their thoughts. He spoke slowly, each word drawn not from intellect, but from the deep well of meaning that had formed inside him like a spring tapped by the chisel of revelation. "I think we were made to remember," he said, "not just in mind, but in being. Our bones, our hands, even our voices, they carry echoes of the first making, the shaping done not by accident, but by will, by desire. And in forgetting that, we did not become lesser, we became louder. We filled the quiet with noise because we feared what it might say if we left it unfilled. But here I feel as though silence is not something to be feared, but something to be entered, like a temple or a dream. And inside it I hear, welcome. Not judgment, not demand, just welcome." There was a long pause after his words, not out of uncertainty, but out of need, to let the truth of them sink into the stone and return, as echoes do, altered slightly by the walls of the world, but carrying the same heart. Dervy leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her voice gruff as ever, but softened now with the lilt of awe. "I've carved stone my whole life," she said. "I've chipped and shaped and smoothed it until it took the form I wanted. But I never thought to ask what the stone wanted to be. I never listened to the resistance or the grain. I fought it, forced it. And maybe that's what we've done to ourselves, too. Carved a shape we thought was strength, and never asked if it was truth." Balgrren the miner nodded beside her, his voice like gravel shifting beneath a boot. "There's a tunnel I once dug," he said, "far down where the roots of the mountain groan in their sleep. I remember how the walls there seemed to breathe, not with air, but with pressure, with weight, with time itself. I was afraid of it then, thought it meant collapse or fault. But now I wonder, maybe the mountain wasn't threatening. Maybe it was speaking. Maybe we just never learned the language." The flame flickered then, not brighter, not higher, but wider as though spreading its arms. Shadows danced along the curved walls, and for a moment those watching could swear they saw shapes within them. Not faces, not forms, but movements, rhythms, as if the past itself stirred behind the veil of firelight, not demanding to be relived, but offering to be remembered. The chamber had become a mirror, not of appearances, but of essence. And into that light stepped Brewerham, the young one, his eyes wide but steady, his voice thin but clear like a rivulet carving its way through new stone. "If this is our beginning," he said, "then let it also be our promise not to make a new religion or a new name for what we do not understand, but to walk forward with listening hearts, to craft not only with our tools, but with our silence, to mine not only for ore, but for meaning, to remember in every strike of the hammer, every stroke of the chisel, that we are not alone, that we were never alone." And so the silence returned, but it was no longer silence. It was communion. It was memory made manifest not through words alone, but through the presence of souls who had rediscovered their root, not in lineage or law, but in the quiet, burning truth that there is something beneath all stone, beneath all song, beneath all work and war and wonder. Mahal had not departed, he had simply waited. And now in the hollow heart of the world, his children had knelt, not to worship, but to listen. And the mountain listened back, not with thunder, not with quake, but with breath, with light, with love.